are seeing the true intentions of Vladimir Putin, which is to maintain a strong position in Syria.
To lead, we need to create a strategy to take out Assad and to take out ISIS.
We must make it crystal clear to Russia that they do not get to move into the Middle East and become the dominant outside power, which is clearly their intentions.
Needless to say, Republican leaders and candidates not too thrilled with the Russians, let alone the handling of the situation in Syria by the Obama administration. But from a military standpoint, what can the U.S. do to deal with Russia? Let's bring in our panel. Richard Brodsky, former Democratic New York State Assemblyman, senior fellow now at Demos, a professor at NYU, and very active in media. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, and Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. And I should preface this by saying, as I showed you off the top, that we could be interrupting this conversation shortly if President Obama comes to the microphone, as he's expected to this hour, out of the White House, speaking to that tragedy at the Oregon school. But we talked about what is the end game of Putin here. Nobody really knows. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can play this. Everyone's playing armchair psychologist.
You can treat Putin as a crazy person, as a tyrant, all of which he may be.
But
or
he's
you
getting
can
leverage.
treat him as a politician who has an agenda. It makes more sense to do it the latter way because at least it gives you some things to do. What won't work is posturing and military belligerence.
I agree with you. Okay, but here's the question, Richard. When we have a situation that happened earlier where literally our military was given 1 hour's notice that Russians were going to be flying MiGs in there and that you better be careful, we're coming in no matter what. It lends itself to a totally foreseeable situation where an accident could happen and people could die.
I never thought I'd have to say this, but you sound like Carly Fiorina.
No, I'm
we
not
must
sounding.
not allow and we must do this. Everybody can state the problem, which you just did, with great precision, which you just did. The question you asked throughout the first segment,
what do you do about it?
And now is what do you do about it? Well, what Putin is actually doing is he's strengthening Assad and making Assad the opposition to ISIS, so that the rest of the world is going to have to choose between Assad and ISIS. Who are you going to choose? I choose Assad, not because I like him, not because he's not a murderer, not because he's not an awful regime, but because ISIS is worse.
Okay.
And that's what Putin's doing,
However,
and that's the problem you
However,
have to solve.
I think if we know anything about Putin, and we give him credit, as Richard said, is more the latter than the former, that this is a politician with an agenda, not just a lunatic, to pretend that he has any loyalty to Assad is ridiculous. He considers it better than the alternative. They had a working relationship, which was beneficial to Russia. He wants to be relevant into the Middle East. I think all these things we can check off the box. However, I think the end game is he wants to get rid of these crippling sanctions against Russia. And for him, he'll trade Assad in a heartbeat here as long as we can agree on the alternative, which isn't a void. If it means it will drop the sanctions, if he does the dirty work, and gets rid of ISIS.
He's doing the dirty work now.
But he's also going after the rebels that we're arming.
No, I understand that. He wants to keep Assad in power, which as a counterbalance to the threat from ISIS. He's more threatened by ISIS. And actually, he's taking a pretty big risk in this also because, if the ISIS threat bleeds across the border, it bleeds into Russia, and that could be potentially damaging to Russian security. I got no problem letting him prop up Assad for the time being. Why do we have to cave on the sanctions in order for that to happen?
Well,
he's already doing what we want him to do.
Well, he's not, though. Today, and apparently tomorrow, there's going to be bombing sorties against our armed rebels that we put in place that were opposition forces that weren't all, I'm not saying these are choir boys, but apparently these are not, akin to pure ISIS. These are people that we deemed to be anti-government leaders here that we were willing to not only fund but get behind and arm. And now they're indiscriminately bombing these guys, and we're sitting back and saying he's doing our dirty work for us? Says who?
I don't think those guys are much of a factor. First of all, they're not exactly doing a bang-up job countering ISIS or countering Assad. And second of all, we've had difficulty training them to do anything effective. If they're, a casualty of the situation, sounds crass to say, but I think that's the way they're going to wind up being. And again, Assad's doing
the translation of these two guys, and I'm not even saying they're wrong, is if you go back and look at Libya, Egypt, Iraq, we all agree horrible SOBs. Tyrants, genocidal lunatics, whatever you want to call them, every description would be right. I think if you put truth simmer to both the former president and the sitting president and say, would you rather have taken those despots over what's filled the void in the interim, they probably would hold their nose and say yes. I think there's some second thoughts right now to say, is the devil we know better than the one we don't, with what would follow Assad? I never thought I'd hear folks say this, but I'm even seeing folks on the left saying, I don't need this anymore. Let the tyrants do it. They're the ones who can keep this thing under control.
I couldn't have said it better, honestly. You just did. You answered
They won't
your
admit
own.
it, but they think the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, there's no. How could you disagree with that assessment that was just made? I mean, we're dealing with tyrants and people that don't have the best interest of the U.S. And yes, they may be bad people, but look at what's coming after them. Exactly, piggybacking on your point. Issue number one, and maybe you can tell me if this has been fully resolved 24 hours later, but was Russia really targeting ISIS, or is that
they
really
clearly
just
are targeting the rebel troops that we've armed.
so
and
to
supported.
help Assad?
Yes.
Okay, so that's issue number one. And the second thing is the U.S., what they've got to do immediately is open the channels of communication. Again, going back to
Military
your
leaders
point,
are going to have
right,
face-to-face conversations.
so that these
here, too.
military planes
We're
won't
not-
crash
we're not
into each
military
other.
experts, but this is not
for
rocket
yourself.
science.
Yeah.
We have that's right, Colonel.
Yeah,
thank
thank
you.
you. Go ahead.
This is not rocket science. We have three players: Assad, ISIS, and Russia. Now, we don't like Russia. We don't like Assad. We don't like ISIS. But if I had to choose as to which of those three would be my first priority for doing the most damage to, it would be ISIS. And if that's the case, you may actually have to work with people like Putin and Assad.
I'm not saying
ISIS
you're wrong, but
is
you
the
know that
target.
there is an argument that is the greatest recruitment tool for ISIS that exists is Assad right now. And the longer you preserve and keep him in power, I mean, to me, the most ideal thing is you work something out with the back room
Let's
and say,
let's say that
let's find
happens.
an exit plan for him. We're going to get him out in 2 years and put somebody else in place here that will decide, either some coalition or whatever else. But the idea that you leave him in here, I mean, what does it say about the
American
U.S. power,
policy
by the way?
should focus on ISIS and defeating ISIS.
Let's say that Assad is the biggest argument and biggest recruiting tool for ISIS. Where's that ISIS anger going to be directed? The guy who's propping up Assad. That's Putin. That's really not our problem. We got to make sure it doesn't become our problem, but that's really not our problem. And go back to your
All right,
earlier
I
point.
got to interrupt you for a second. Let's go live to the White House. The president speaking to the tragedy in Oregon.
That means there's another community stunned with grief, and communities across the country forced to relieve their own anguish, and parents across the country who are scared because they know it might have been their families or their children. I've been to Roseburg, Oregon. There are really good people there. I want to thank all the first responders whose bravery likely saved some lives today. Federal law enforcement has been on the scene in a supporting role, and we've offered to stay and help as much as Roseburg needs for as long as they need. In the coming days, we'll learn about the victims, young men and women who were studying and learning and working hard, their eyes set on the future, their dreams on what they could make of their lives. And America will wrap everyone who's grieving with our prayers and our love. But as I said just a few months ago, and I said a few months before that, and I said each time we see one of these mass shootings, our thoughts and prayers are not enough. It's not enough. It does not capture the heartache and grief and anger that we should feel. And it does nothing to prevent this carnage from being inflicted someplace else in America. Next week, or a couple of months from now. We don't yet know why this individual did what he did. And it's fair to say that anybody who does this has a sickness in their minds, regardless of what they think their motivations may be. But we are not the only country on earth that has people with mental illnesses or want to do harm to other people. We are the only advanced country on earth that sees these kinds of mass shootings every few months. Earlier this year, I answered a question in an interview by saying, the United States of America is the one advanced nation on earth in which we do not have sufficient common sense gun safety laws, even in the face of repeated mass killings. And later that day, there was a mass shooting at a movie theater in Lafayette, Louisiana. That day. Somehow this has become routine. The reporting is routine. My response here at this podium ends up being routine. The conversation in the aftermath of it, we've become numb to this. We talked about this after Columbine and Blacksburg, after Tucson, after Newtown, after Aurora, after Charleston. It cannot be this easy for somebody who wants to inflict harm on other people to get his or her hands on a gun. And what's become routine, of course, is the response of those who oppose any kind of common sense gun legislation. Right now, I can imagine the press releases being cranked out. We need more guns, they'll argue. Fewer gun safety laws. Does anybody really believe that? There are scores of responsible gun owners in this country. They know that's not true. We know because of the polling that says the majority of Americans understand we should be changing these laws, including the majority of responsible, law-abiding gun owners. There is a gun for roughly every man, woman, and child in America. So how can you, with a straight face, make the argument that more guns will make us safer? We know that states with the most gun laws tend to have the fewest gun deaths. So the notion that gun laws don't work or just will make it harder for law-abiding citizens and criminals will still get their guns, it's not borne out by the evidence. We know that other countries, in response to one mass shooting, have been able to craft laws that almost eliminate mass shootings. Friends of ours, allies of ours, Great Britain, Australia, countries like ours. So we know there are ways to prevent it. And of course, what's also routine is that somebody somewhere will comment and say, Obama politicized this issue. Well, this is something we should politicize.
1515.
It is relevant to our common life together, to the body politic. I would ask news organizations, because I won't put these facts forward, have news organizations tally up the number of Americans who've been killed through terrorist attacks over the last decade and the number of Americans who've been killed by gun violence. And post those side by side on your news reports. This won't be information coming from me, it will be coming from you. We spend over $1 trillion and pass countless laws and devote entire agencies to preventing terrorist attacks on our soil, and rightfully so. And yet, we have a Congress that explicitly blocks us from even collecting data on how we could potentially reduce gun deaths. How can that be? This is a political choice that we make. to allow this to happen every few months in America. We collectively are answerable to those families who lose their loved ones because of our inaction. When Americans are killed in mine disasters, we work to make mines safer. When Americans are killed in floods and hurricanes, we make communities safer. When roads are unsafe, we fix them to reduce auto fatalities. We have seatbelt laws because we know it saves lives. So the notion that gun violence is somehow different, that our freedom and our Constitution prohibits any modest regulation of how we use a deadly weapon, when there are law-abiding gun owners all across the country who could hunt and protect their families and do everything they do under such regulations. Doesn't make sense. So, tonight, as those of us who are lucky enough to hug our kids a little closer, are thinking about the families who aren't so fortunate, I'd ask the American people to think about how they can get our government to change these laws and to save lives and to let young people grow up. And that will require a change of politics on this issue. And it will require that the American people, individually, whether you are a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, when you decide to vote for somebody, are making a determination as to whether this cause of continuing death for innocent people should be a relevant factor in your decision. If you think this is a problem, then you should expect your elected officials to reflect your views. And I would particularly ask America's gun owners who are using those guns properly, safely, to hunt, for sport, for protecting their families, to think about whether your views are properly being represented by the organization that suggests it's speaking for you. And each time this happens, I'm going to bring this up. Each time this happens, I am going to say that we can actually do something about it, but we're going to have to change our laws. And this is not something I can do by myself. I've got to have a Congress, and I've got to have state legislatures and governors who are willing to work with me on this. I hope and pray that I don't have to come out again during my tenure as president to offer my condolences to families in these circumstances. But based on my experience as president, I can't guarantee that. And that's terrible to say. And it can change. May God bless the memories of those who were killed today. May He bring comfort to their families and courage to the injured as they fight their way back. And may He give us the strength to come together and find the courage to change. Thank you.
And as Andrew mentioned to me, that is the 15th time in this Obama presidency that he's had to address the country after a mass shooting, the 15th time. And unfortunately, there have been many more than that in the last 6.5 to 7 years. All right, when we come back, the panel and I are going to talk about what we just heard, very powerful statement from the president and a call to action. Stay with us.